It's wonderful to be here with you all. We all need to be sounding the alarm about the dangers of private school vouchers. So I'm going to give you some background on what they are, why they are so dangerous, current developments across the country in state legislatures, and also the efforts that are going on in the courts. And I'll be very happy to answer questions. So thank you so much. Okay, hopefully you all can see that. I work at Education Law Center, which is a nonprofit legal organization that pursues justice and equity for public school students. And we take on a number of different issues to promote that goal, including fair and adequate school funding, student civil rights, and anti-privatization efforts. The Public Funds Public Schools campaign is a national campaign led by Education Law Center to ensure that public funds for education are used to support and strengthen public schools and are not diverted to private education uses, such as any form of private school voucher. And to achieve these goals, we engage in a range of strategies, and all of these are strategies that folks like you and organizations you might be involved in can participate in and can support. And we are here to support groups like yours and many state and local organizations across the country who are working on these same issues. So that's our goal. We engage in litigation efforts in the courts, research and data analysis, policy advocacy, communications, and strategic partnerships and collaborations, which is why I'm so happy to be here with you all today, because the key is for all of us to work together. There is a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of power behind efforts to privatize our public education system. And so the way that we can counter that is by working together. I also want to mention that vouchers are just one of a multi-pronged attack on public education. And ELC works on many of those other prongs of the attack, but Public Funds Public Schools is focused on the growing threat of vouchers. And I'll be happy to talk some more about how those threads come together. So private school vouchers redirect public money to private education uses. And they come in many different forms, but it's important to know that these are all forms of vouchers, no matter how the other side tries to disguise them. So conventional vouchers, the oldest type, pay for a student's private school tuition with direct payments from state funds. Education savings account vouchers are just another strain, if anything, even more harmful, because they are public funds that are deposited into a personal account, basically like a debit card, and they can be used to pay for private school tuition or a wide range of other private education expenses like tutoring, online courses, transportation, even homeschooling in a lot of cases. And so they're even more unregulated and prone to fraud and waste. Tax credit vouchers or tax credit scholarship vouchers are a system to take money that should belong in the public treasury and should go to public goods like public schools and instead divert it to private education expenses. So this is how it works. Individuals or corporations give money that they otherwise owe in taxes instead to a third-party private voucher granting organization. And those taxpayers get a credit on their taxes, not a deduction, but an actual credit of up to 100% on that money. So it's also not really a charitable endeavor. You're getting back the money. You're getting a credit back on money that you would have owed. So they give the money to a voucher granting organization, and that organization gives out the vouchers. So even though there's a couple of extra steps, this is functionally the same as the conventional vouchers, just paying for private education expenses with public funds or funds that would have been in the public treasury but for this scheme. It's really important to know that these are all vouchers, and it's important to call them all vouchers because the public doesn't like vouchers. The public knows what vouchers are. The public has a general sense of the harms of vouchers. And the reason that they're always shape-shifting and changing name and changing form is because those promoting them are trying to evade legal criticism. They're trying to evade policy criticism. They're trying to evade public opinion, negative public opinion on vouchers. And so that's why it's so important to pinpoint these, recognize them, call them vouchers, and oppose them all. Depending how you count, there are approximately 31 states plus the District of Columbia that already have voucher programs. The number of states with voucher programs and the scale of those voucher programs has grown dramatically over the last 3 to 4 years, including about 10 states that now have voucher programs with universal eligibility, meaning that there's no eligibility criteria. Even the wealthiest families can receive vouchers. Any child in the state can receive a voucher, even if they've never been in public school, even if they've always been in private school. So I'll talk more about universal vouchers, but this is the scale of things that we're looking at. Luckily, the facts about vouchers are on our side. So although pro-voucher groups claim that research shows that vouchers have positive effects, like on academic outcomes, it's simply not true. It's been largely debunked by many different peer-reviewed, reliable studies, and countered by a mountain of evidence about vouchers' harmful effects that just keeps growing and growing. So I've listed here some of vouchers' harmful effects on students, schools, and communities. First, they divert funds away from public schools and undermine our public education system. And I'll talk more about that. Second, voucher programs increase racial segregation in schools. They also publicly fund discrimination against students of color, students with disabilities, students of minority religions, LGBTQ students and families, English learners, many groups of students, because private schools are largely allowed to discriminate against students in ways that public schools are not allowed and would never be allowed to do. Voucher students also not only don't improve their academic outcomes by taking a voucher, they actually fare worse academically in many cases than their public school peers. That's something that the pro-voucher groups don't want you to know. But again, mounting evidence as we get more data, as private school voucher programs grow, and as time goes on and more studies are done, we only see more evidence for all of these effects that I'm talking about. And finally, voucher programs lack standards, accountability, and transparency. So they lead to a lot of fraud and waste. And they also lack quality standards like teacher accreditation standards, curriculum standards, fiscal accountability standards, governance standards for the schools. So all things that exist in public schools, but don't exist for publicly funded private schools in voucher programs. The bottom line is that public education is the cornerstone of our democracy, and we believe that all students deserve access to thriving schools in their communities that are open to all children and that are accountable to those communities. And vouchers are antithetical to these goals. They divert funding and resources away from this goal of thriving public schools that are open to every student and welcoming to all students. One of the most powerful arguments against vouchers is the fact that they are extremely expensive. Much of what I'm sharing today here is laid out in greater detail in a fact sheet that we have on the Public Funds Public Schools website called The True Cost of Private School Voucher Programs. So I encourage you to check out the resources on our website. But let me talk about 3 buckets of arguments related to the cost of vouchers. First is just the plain old argument that vouchers are very expensive for the states. As voucher programs become more expansive, including universal programs in many states, the fiscal impacts have taken on an even greater urgency. So research lays out the simple truth that these programs cost a lot of money. For example, a 2021 policy brief estimated that implementing universal vouchers throughout the country would increase the total cost to the public of education by 11 to 33%, or $66 to $203 billion per year it would take to implement nationwide this second unaccountable system of private schooling. Another argument that can be persuasive, particularly with those who are fiscally conservative, is that vouchers entail a lot of fraud and waste, driving costs higher, as I just mentioned. And this stems from overpayments to private schools, overspending by organizations that distribute vouchers, et cetera, et cetera. Related to this, you will hear voucher proponents argue that vouchers actually save the state money because the money just follows the child, right? Many of us have probably heard this, right? Let the money follow the child. You won't have to spend any extra money, and let parents choose where the money follows their child. We have another fact sheet debunking this myth that vouchers save states money. So I encourage you to check that out, but here are some of the reasons. Vouchers just shift education expenses to parents because voucher amounts are usually too small to cover the cost of tuition, let alone other things that public schools provide for free, like transportation, food, special education services. So those costs are not, they may be shifted off the state, but they're just shifted to parents. Voucher programs also don't change what are called fixed or stranded costs in public schools. So schools that have less enrollment will receive, public schools that have less enrollment will receive less money, but they have the same fixed financial obligations in a lot of realms, like building maintenance, heating the buildings, transportation, the library. If you take one or two kids out of different classrooms in a school, you're not going to be able to reduce the number of teachers or the librarian or the cafeteria services. And therefore, those schools are struggling because they have those stranded costs. Another reason, this last one I'll mention, is that voucher programs concentrate high need and higher cost students in public schools because of the discrimination in many private schools that won't take these students because of the cost or other ideological reasons that they don't want to take higher need students. And so those students are concentrated in public schools that now have fewer resources to serve them. Okay. Two, another major truth about voucher spending is that it increases over time. This is almost inevitable. That's what research shows. So a classic tactic of school privatizers is to start with a limited voucher program to get a foot in the door and then expand over time. Last year, Public Funds Public Schools published a report by Drs. Samuel Abrams and Stephen Koutsopoulos at Teachers College, Columbia University, and I have a picture of the cover on the screen. It's called The Fiscal Consequences of Private School Vouchers, and it examines the growth in voucher programs and spending in 7 states in the decade following the Great Recession, so about 2008 to 2019. And the findings were that in each of the 7 states, expenditures of public funds on voucher programs increased dramatically over that 10-year period, with growth in voucher spending in Georgia, for example, reaching 883%. Nearly all the states examined in the study were diverting hundreds of millions of dollars to voucher programs annually by the end of the period studied. And in the years since, several have reached over $1 billion annually, billion with a B. At the same time, funding for vouchers climbed significantly in these 7 states. The portion of state GDP allocated to K-12 public education decreased, even though public school enrollment grew over the same period in 5 of 7 states. So as voucher spending went up dramatically, the percent of GDP being spent on our public schools, which still serve the vast majority of students, was going down. Another report by the Florida Policy Institute and Education Law Center about Florida's voucher spending found that public school funds diverted annually to private education increased by approximately $1 billion between 2019-20 and 2022-23. And the report estimated that the state's education savings account voucher program would cost $1.3 billion for the 2022-23 school year alone, in addition to over $1 billion to fund the state's tax credit voucher program in fiscal year 2023. And now that Florida has fully universalized its voucher program, vouchers there are costing several $1 billion per year. Finally, you can't trust a lot of the cost estimates coming from legislatures and pro-voucher groups. They are frequently dramatic underexpressions of the true cost of voucher programs. To take just one example, New Hampshire's ESA voucher program was projected to cost the state about $130,000, but by 2023, spending on the program was nearly $15 million. And an independent analysis released by a group called Reaching Higher New Hampshire projects that that program, which has been expanded, could cost $48 million per year. Finally, I want to note the importance of giving the broader context of public school underfunding, right? That's why we're here, to protect public schools so that they have the resources to serve all children well. So many states with voucher programs already underfund their public schools. Education Law Center's annual Making the Grade report is a great resource to show you where your state falls in terms of overall funding levels, funding effort, and funding fairness for your public schools. And of course, you'll have individual resources and stories from families in your communities about what resources their public schools might be lacking. We know that vouchers undermine funding for public schools. Sometimes this is because voucher funds are diverted even directly from public education budgets, and I'll be happy to talk a little bit more about how that works. But the bottom line is vouchers take money away from our public schools. So it can be powerful to point out that vouchers should not be funded when the public education system isn't even adequately funded. And public education, an adequate public education, is guaranteed to all students in their state constitutions across the country. Vouchers shouldn't be funded at all, but they certainly shouldn't be funded when public schools are underfunded. So there are powerful groups pushing untruths about vouchers, including their costs. That's why I wanted to share with you some of the real facts and information. What's more factual than the numbers, right? And I encourage you to check out these resources on our website. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but this is a pullout from that 2023 Public Funds Public Schools report that documented the growth in voucher spending over time. This is Arizona. And in the time since this analysis, and this analysis stopped at 2019, that was the most recently available data at that time. Since then, Arizona became the first state to universalize its voucher program, and the costs have skyrocketed to some estimates about $1 billion per year. It's bankrupting the state right now. It's causing fiscal havoc in the state and for its public schools. Public funds, public schools, another thing we do is to track and categorize all voucher bills in all state legislatures and the US Congress every year. And we make that information publicly available on the bill tracker on our website. And there's also a short explainer video there to walk you through how to use the bill tracking tool. So I encourage you to visit that at pfps.org, and then you go to the bill tracker. As in recent years, we are in 2024 tracking hundreds of bills, mostly in state legislatures. That's where most of the action on vouchers is. We continue to see a lot of ESA style vouchers, vouchers funded through tax credits, and they have a really wide range of names: Hope scholarships and freedom vouchers and lots of words like that. But they're all fundamentally the same. Starting in 2022, more than 10 states have instituted universal eligibility for their voucher programs, as I mentioned, meaning no criteria, including no income cap or requirement that students have previously been in public school. And there are many additional proposals for universal vouchers this year. For example, that fight is going on in the Louisiana legislature as we speak. A new trend that started last year is the introduction and passage of large-scale refundable tax credits for private education expenses. This is something that's really flying under the radar because it's yet another attempt to morph the name and the form of vouchers, but I wanted you to know about it. These are programs that allow people to get a large tax credit back for their child's own private education expenses. So a family pays for private school and they again get a large multi-thousand-dollar tax credit for that expense. They basically get that money back. This, again, will disproportionately go to wealthy families that confront that cost, among many other problems. Pro-voucher groups are also putting a massive amount of energy and funding behind these bills, even though polls show that vouchers are unpopular with the public. These pro-voucher groups use the culture wars, working to undermine confidence in public education through things like anti-CRT laws and book bans, and trying to weaken public school funding in order to create an appetite for privatization. Another thing to be aware of is the push in recent years for ballot measures to institute vouchers or constitutional amendments that would clear the way for voucher legislation. For example, such a constitutional amendment will be voted on in Kentucky this year in the November election. There are also efforts to repeal voucher legislation at the ballot box, including in Nebraska right now. There's such an effort. Unfortunately, some significant voucher bills have passed this year, including a large-scale tax credit in Alabama, a universal education savings account voucher in Wyoming, and a new additional voucher program in Georgia. But there also have been a lot of wins to defeat voucher bills, as there are every year. For example, a universal voucher bill died again in Idaho this year, and in Tennessee, a proposal to universalize vouchers also failed. Even in many red states, vouchers failed. Texas has remained voucher-free year after year, and dozens of these voucher bills fail. So we hope that we can stop voucher bills before they pass, but when legislatures choose to pass voucher laws and they violate the state's constitutional protections for public schools or other constitutional mandates, then they can be challenged in court. So that's the last major strategy I want to alert you to fight voucher bills. Back in 2016, for example, we represented plaintiffs who challenged the nation's first universal voucher program in Nevada, and we won. The Supreme Court of Nevada struck down that bill. Bringing us up closer to today, in 2022, there was a lawsuit against Kentucky's tax credit ESA voucher bill, and the Kentucky Supreme Court unanimously struck down that voucher law, and Kentucky remains voucher-free because of it. Just as important as the actual lawsuits is the support of advocacy and communication efforts that were happening at the same time, and that's one way that non-legal groups can be involved in the litigation stage of advocacy as well. There are currently 3 lawsuits challenging vouchers that are pending in state courts. A very important case in Ohio challenging that state's long-running voucher program, which is gutting public education budgets. Education Law Center is involved as co-counsel in the other 2 pending cases. In Tennessee, we've been litigating for years against that state's ESA voucher program that applies mostly to Memphis, Nashville, and Memphis. In South Carolina, the state Supreme Court recently heard oral argument in our challenge to a 2023 voucher law there. So we're very proud to be representing the plaintiffs in these cases who are standing up for their public schools. And we intend to keep doing this. If you think there may be an opportunity to do any type of advocacy in your state, whether it's through the courts or the legislatures or anything, we encourage you to get in touch with us and take advantage of our resources. So the last thing I wanted to make sure you had is our website and just an alert to the many resources that are on our website. There are so many people across the country like you all working to ensure that children have access to well-funded and welcoming public schools. And as I said, we Public Funds Public Schools is here to support you. There are so many ways that we can work together. And I hope that this conversation is the start of more of those collaborations.
Thank you so much for that information. I gave Jessica a list of questions and she answered a bunch of them. So we're going to go into the ones that are left. Actually, since you work for the Education Law Center, one of the things that we talk about a lot at Red, Wine, and Blue is the fact that the extremists who are in office and running for office, one of the goals is to defund public education as a whole. So I don't know if you could speak a little more to that, just in terms of like what you see in your job every single day. And then obviously vouchers fit into that. So maybe just expanding on that a bit.
Well, of course, I can't know what's in other people's hearts and minds, and people will certainly have different motivations. So with that caveat, it is increasingly clear that undermining and destroying public education is a significant motivation for promoting vouchers. And as I mentioned, it is one prong of a multi-pronged attack on public education. And that is not a new story. That's an old story, unfortunately. There have long been efforts to undermine public schools, such as through underfunding, to try to weaken them, right? Weaken their results, weaken what they can do for the families and communities that depend on them, then call them failing, much more than they actually are, and then create an appetite for whatever reforms or privatization many groups want to push. So it's not a new story, but it does have a new sort of flavor, particularly since the COVID pandemic, when there was sort of a perfect storm of conditions for trying to undermine public schools and create distrust and discontent with public schools. Polls show that people overwhelmingly are very happy with their child's local public school. Even during the pandemic, polls show that people were overwhelmingly approving of and happy with how their child's school handled the pandemic. So that's sort of the truth that polls show us. And then there's another narrative on another level that schools are failing and that people don't like public schools and don't want public schools, when it's just not true. So privatization is one prong of the attack. Chronic, severe underfunding is another prong of the attack. A newer prong is these so-called anti-CRT laws, like the Stop Woke Act in Florida, or book bans, or censorship laws that stop teachers from teaching the truth about race in our country, about gender, about different types of families, et cetera, about history. And so those are all prongs of the attack. And then just to zoom out a little bit more, the attacks on public education are part of the attacks on our democracy itself. As I said, public education is the cornerstone of our democracy. It's our largest, most central public good. And so attacks on voting rights and on other public institutions, are including public education, are all part of this attack on our democracy.
Can you talk a little bit about, and I know you showed the slides about, how vouchers add to racial disparities, add to lack of access to, special needs, special education. I think it might be nice to have some clarification around private school admissions and what these schools do and do not have to do in terms of admitting students. Because, I think a lot of people think, oh, well, great, we give kids who are in underperforming districts money and they're just going to go to this great private school and get an education. but they have to get admitted.
That's right. That's exactly right. So there are many reasons that a private school voucher system doesn't and can't serve so many of the students that voucher proponents claim they are meant for. So just to, before getting to students with disabilities and others, low-income students, that was the original claim about vouchers, that it would provide another option, right, to families that couldn't so-called access these private schools for lack of funds. But what we see is that the voucher funds frequently are not even close to private school tuition. And then on top of tuition, there are all these other things a family has to pay for that a low-income family still won't be able to access private schools. So that's part of why it's not true that these programs serve low-income students. When it comes then to students with disabilities, LGBTQ students or LGBTQ families, English learners, private schools under the law are allowed to discriminate against these students and families. They're allowed to refuse to admit them. There are, some differences in state laws. There are a few protections under a few voucher laws, but by and large, these schools are not required to admit all sorts of different students, even though they're receiving public funding. And it's really important that people know this because it's a really ugly fact about voucher programs. Another ugly fact is that voucher programs originated in the modern era with massive resistance to integration after the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So voucher programs proliferated in the 50s and 60s to give white families money to attend segregation academies. And there's a lot of legacy of that in voucher programs today with their segregative effects, which we can talk about more. But there's a lot of aspects to this that we really have to ask: how can you defend publicly funding the discrimination against so many students? And then again, it concentrates higher need students in public schools that now have fewer resources to serve them. For example, students with disabilities.
One of the things you talked about was that there was a lack of accountability and transparency behind vouchers. What would be an example, if these are in place, or the rule, if these are established in your state, like what would you want to see in terms of transparency? What would you want to see the law be in terms of accountability? I mean, I'm in Ohio. We had a huge scandal around, online public school where they were saying all these students were coming and they weren't, but they were getting public funds for a lot of public funds. So I would love to kind of hear, like, what do you think should be the accountability and transparency in these rules?
Well, the first thing to note is that there are no changes, improvements, additions, amendments to voucher laws that can make them good public policy. So even if you added transparency and accountability measures, there would still be so many reasons, why they're terrible public policy and also unconstitutional is a separate matter. But in terms of what accountability there should be, there should be a lot more data collection. And that's not to say that it will be enforced, because there are some places where they're trying to enforce data collection. The data is still not good. So even in an ideal world, this doesn't make the policies good policies. Then even if you implement good transparency and accountability language, there's a real question as to whether it will be enforced and the data will actually be collected. But we do need a lot more transparency in these programs, because from what we know, they cause all these harms. From the data that we do have, they decrease academic outcomes, they exacerbate segregation, they fund discrimination. But we need to know more. That's just what basic that's owed to the public when public money is spent. And the last thing I'll say is that it seems clear that the lack of transparency and accountability measures in these bills, which has only gotten worse over time, is not an accident. Because there are all these negative effects, those who are pushing these policies don't want the public to have data on them. And so they fight against transparency and accountability measures. And there are fewer and fewer in these laws. And we have to ask why.
I wonder why they don't want the data. Why could that possibly be, Jessica? Okay. So you kind of touched on this in your presentation, but I just wanted to circle back and maybe there's more to say on this. How are you all, what are the legal challenges? Like, how are you going to court and challenging these? What are you saying? What are you arguing?
There are so many ways that voucher programs can violate the law. So I'll just give you a few of them, but they're incredibly legally problematic in addition to being terrible public policy. So most challenges to voucher programs are brought under state constitutions, because that is where we find the right to public education is in state constitutions. They all have education clauses, and those vary in their form and in their specific language. But one major way that vouchers can violate state constitutions is by undermining that constitutional requirement that students receive an adequate and equitable public education. A lot of state constitutions also mandate specifically public education with therefore an implied disallowment of the funding of private education. They specifically are only allowing public education. Additionally, a lot of state constitutions have what are called no aid clauses that specifically say no public funding of private schools. Now, these are being challenged by right-wing legal groups, pro-voucher legal groups, because these are one of the major impediments to establishing voucher programs. They were put in state constitutions very deliberately to protect public school funding. Now, privatizers will argue that they are Blaine amendments, that they were modeled after a federal constitutional amendment that failed, but that they say inspired these state constitutional provisions, and that they were born of anti-religious animus, to not give money to religious schools. That's really not true. The historical evidence from many of these states shows that they were put in place to create a constitutional firewall, protecting public school funds, because founders knew that public education was our most important public good, and they knew that funds would be limited for that, and they wanted to protect education funds for public education. That's the grounds on which the Kentucky voucher law was struck down in 2022, for example. To give you just a couple other examples, there are arguments to be made about the discrimination that voucher programs entail. There are a lot of provisions in state constitutions basically prohibiting these types of policies that fund discrimination, that leave out certain groups of people and students. These programs can be counter to public policy. And so there are lots, as you can see, there are lots and lots of ways that voucher programs violate state constitutions, and that's what most of the challenges are about. I'll also mention that in Ohio, one of the legal claims is about the segregative effects of voucher programs. Because those programs that you have in Ohio are long running, there is a lot of data about how they have resegregated public schools, and so there are also legal claims about the segregative effects of vouchers.
Yeah, I remember this statistic. When I had younger kids in school, like I think we were fifth in Ohio. Ohio was like fifth in the nation for education. I believe we're like 31st or 32nd. I mean, we've fallen so far for so many reasons here because extremist legislature, vouchers, things like that. One last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Julie for any questions from the chat, because I've seen a lot of things going on in the chat, so I'm assuming it's pretty busy in there. So, how would you suggest talking to like maybe neighbors or friends who, hear the talking points about vouchers, that they're helpful, or, maybe they even have an experience, and I saw this question in the chat that like, there's the one-off story where like they helped a family, right? So like, how do you talk about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's important, I think, to say that we and others who are fighting against vouchers are not faulting individual families for choosing whatever is the best for their child. Individual families doing that are not the issue. It's the systemic structural laws and policies that are being pushed by those who don't have a positive agenda for students that is the problem. So it's the systemic policies that we fault and that we fight against. The way I think to talk to people, first of all, is to know them, know your community, because unfortunately there are so many harms of vouchers. There's a lot to choose from in what you talk about, and what your neighbor might care about, what your local representative might care about, et cetera. And so you can choose from these different talking points, the cost, the discrimination, the segregation, the academic outcomes. So know your audience. And I think having people talk to each other, though, is so powerful, because educators are so respected in our communities, for example. And so having educators talk about these issues with their neighbors in small forums is really the way to get the word out. I would also say that I would just encourage people when you're talking to your neighbor or your friend, just to dig a little deeper under the pro-voucher arguments, because that's all it takes to see them fall apart. For example, the idea that vouchers save the state money, it only makes sense on the very most surface level. But as soon as you start thinking about those fixed or stranded costs in schools, that schools can't just decrease when they lose a few pupils, or the fact that a lot of private schools won't take students with disabilities, so they'll be concentrated in the public schools, it all falls apart. So just to dig a little bit deeper on that, and you sort of see that all the arguments from the pro-voucher groups aren't actually true.
I see some good answers in the chat. I know one person on here is I believe a school board elected official pushing back. So she had a very good answer in the chat too. So Julie, I'm going to turn it over to you because like I said, I see the chat blowing up. So I am sure there are lots of questions.
Yes, there actually are. And in fact, we won't get to all of them. I know we won't. So I'm going to try to combine what I can. So the first thing that I'm going to ask you, Jessica, is please share your website again. And what kinds of, briefly, what kinds of resources are on there for folks? Because I think that's one of the biggest things that's been asked over and over.
Sure, and I'll try to keep the answers brief so we can get to as many as possible. The website for Public Funds Public Schools is pfps.org. And then you can get to all the different resources. One of the most important pages is the advocacy page. That has all of our fact sheets on different topics, our talking points on different topics. It has our state-specific policy briefs. It has recordings of our large webinar series on all different types of topics where we have academics and authors and parents and school board members and others. There's also a research page that has not only the research that Public Funds Public Schools has published, but it has a compendium of voucher research on all these different types of harms that I've talked today about, with links to them and summaries of them. The website also has the bill tracker, so you can see what's going on with bills in your state. You can search for similar types of bills across the country. And the litigation page has information on the court cases I've talked about. And finally, the contact us page. Please sign up for updates. We won't inundate you. It's only 1 or 2 a month. And please get in touch with us. We answer numerous requests for assistance every week. And so we are happy to point you to specific resources that you need or talk to you about specific issues that are going on in your state or community.
Julie, there's been a lot of talk about Project 2025 in the chat. Would you, we have a resource for that here at Red Wine and Blue. So Julie is going to drop that link, I believe. Okay, so Jessica, where would we find national or state statistics of the percentage of K through 12 students who are in private versus public schools on your page, or could we find that somewhere else?
We are actually hoping to launch a publicly available website that would go state by state and provide those types of statistics. In the meantime, I can tell you that about 90% of students are in public schools across the country. It's about 10% in private schools. And we are also can generate for you for your state the numbers of overall students, the race breakdown of public versus private school students, religious schools versus non-religious schools. So feel free to get in touch if you would like a sheet on that breakdown for your state, and we're going to try to make that information also publicly available soon.
I want to ask if you had, if you were able to identify pro-voucher groups that folks should be looking out for behind the scenes, because they've got some things going on in their state.
Sure. There are a lot of very powerful pro-voucher groups, as I mentioned. Organizations like the Heritage Foundation or Betsy DeVos's American Federation for Children. And I'll give my email address. I just saw that question. So there are lots of groups like that, conservative think tanks and groups that are putting out, reports and toolkits and things for people to fight for vouchers. There are also groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council that put out voucher model legislation. That's how we see the same types of programs proliferating across the country. And there are legal organizations like, for example, the Institute for Justice that fight to defend vouchers in court and also put up fights, for example, against those constitutional firewalls that I talked about. So in all these different realms, again, there are very powerful groups. Even with all the money and resources that they have, we are able to win victories against them because we are correct. We are correct on the law, and we are also correct that vouchers are terrible public policy and that the public doesn't want them. So again, we need to just keep coming together, and we can protect public schools together.
Are vouchers related to micro schools? I'd not heard of micro schools.
They are related. Micro schools, there's some different definitions, but this is something we saw arise largely during the pandemic. You might have heard of them called like learning pods, or they have different definitions throughout the country in different states. They are related to vouchers in the sense that some voucher laws now include that you can pay for micro schools or expenses for micro schools. For example, a lot of the education savings account vouchers might pay for that stuff because they can pay for a broad range of private education expenses. There are, again, so many problems with them: quality problems, also accountability problems, transparency problems. And so a lot of the things I've talked about are just exacerbated for micro schools.
Someone asked if you all had resources for candidates for school board.
Well, we're a C3 organization, and so we don't participate in electoral efforts, but our resources are on our website, are available to anyone. Our different talking points and resources and research about vouchers.
I'm going to say one thing, jump in, Julie, if you don't mind. So
Sure.
There's a lot of questions about school board candidates, and there's lots of organizations that work, like Lead Ohio. Well, Lead is a training organization for candidates. Emerge is in some states. I was just at a meeting today with the Pipeline Fund, and they actually have a whole messaging document for candidates for school board. So I'm going to drop it here if anybody wants to share that with any friends who might want to run for office.
Perfect. How can states compare if students were using if the students using vouchers were already enrolled in private school? Say this person had seen something in another state where they figured out that the vouchers were being used by students who were already in private school to begin with.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and it's increasingly important as voucher eligibility universalizes. So previously, almost every voucher program had a prior public school enrollment requirement, the idea being that students in public schools would switch to private schools. That's increasingly just not what's happening. And so it also, again, gives the lie to this idea that voucher programs are supposed to open up opportunities for people who didn't otherwise have them, right? When large percentages of these students were already in private school, their families could already afford private school. And increasingly data is coming out of places like Arizona and New Hampshire that overwhelming percentages of students using vouchers in those states, we're talking 75%, 80%, 85% of students were not in public school before. So those are shocking statistics. Professor Josh Cowan from Michigan State University has put together some of those. So I encourage you to look for those. Contact us, we'll give you that information. And it's a very powerful argument, as I said, to counter this idea that vouchers are giving opportunities to students who weren't in private school before.
In looking at the chat, folks are from all over. Someone was from Kentucky and was asking for help. I see in other areas where things are just happening or starting to happen. So if this is the first you've really heard it broken down this way tonight, where do you suggest that folks kind of start in this fight?
Well, you can always start with the Public Funds Public Schools website, pfps.org, and watch some of the webinar recordings, read some of the advocacy resources, read the summaries on the research page. There are other great organizations also doing this work. The Network for Public Education has a lot of great 1 and 2 pagers talking about voucher harms and breaking things down. For research, if you are interested in reading more research about these topics, the National Education Policy Center out of University of Colorado Boulder has a lot of great resources. The National Coalition for Public Education, and I'd be happy to provide these to you all if you have a way to send out to your lists afterward. I can provide you all of these things. But there's a lot of research. But again, there's also a lot of false information out there. There's a lot of so-called research that is, that is not valid peer-reviewed research. And so you need to watch out for that. For research funded by pro-voucher groups, for example, though even some of that research comes out showing the harms of vouchers, so it's hard to avoid. So I would start with those things with our webinars and things like that. And I think unfortunately it's not hyperbolic now to say that that vouchers and school privatization is an existential threat to the essential institution of public education in our country. We are facing a critical moment where more and more money, and now billions of dollars in some states of precious funds that need to go to our underfunded public schools are going to private schools. And so, of course, there are so many important issues going on right now. That's why you all are here. But I would submit to you that this is one of the most important and at the core of saving our democracy.
And the other thing, and I think you may agree with this, is when folks are, because I've seen several narratives in the chat that I suspect have been put out by folks on the other side. And, when they talk about, oh, well, I know this family, or I know this person, or whatever, and likely that's not true with the story that they've heard. We see that a lot with a lot of different issues that have to do with a lot of different things, and especially schools. So, be careful when you're repeating something that you may have just heard that might not be accurate.
And for some great narratives about the harms of voucher programs and similar programs, you can go to a website called Public Voices for Public Schools, which is parents and others speaking out about their experiences, with discrimination against their child, et cetera.
Somebody just asked how many of the red, wine, and blue folks went to public school. I certainly did. I don't know. I think the majority of us did, but I don't know that for sure.
I did, my kids did. Yeah. So the question from Denise was, is anyone else pushing legislation to transparency on tax bills?
Yes, there are. When these bills come up in legislatures, people propose amendments, and sometimes they're about transparency measures. There was a bill that passed in Arkansas a few years ago to require basically the state to put out a report on the voucher program various data. And we've got some resources about that on our website. We wrote to the state legislature after that and said, look at the information that you put out. It shows all these problems with the voucher program, so that can be powerful to take the state's own reports on voucher programs and look at the flaws that are evident there. So yes, I don't know that there's one group that has a model bill, but I can look for that when I'm sending resources.
Okay, well, we appreciate that. And then the last thing I'm going to say, and I know there was a lot of chatter in the chat about Project 2025. I did drop the link to our webpage about that. There's a explainer that you can download. Important to learn about that. Please don't go to their website because that just drives traffic to them. But please share the explainer. Please share that with all of your friends because it is very scary what the plan is. If the election goes the wrong way in 2024 or 2020 for 2025. So you can see all the things. And of course, public education is at the top of the list for being impacted and defunded. But that being said, if you want more information on that, we are actually going to host an event a week from Thursday. I have not yet put it up on the website, but it'll be up by hopefully tomorrow. Wonderful expert from Duke, Professor Nancy McLean, is going to be speaking on that topic. So highly recommend you check that one out too. But otherwise, thank you all for coming. Thank you to Jessica. We really appreciate all the wonderful information. And thank you all. This was an amazing audience, and we're really glad you all came.